World Empires Series Part 12 The Industrial Revolution and the Age of Empire Chapters 7986, 1760, 1914 Add, Introduction. The Enlightenment has provided the ideas. The printing press has spread them. The scientific revolution has provided the method. Now comes the machine. The Industrial Revolution begins in Britain in the second half of the 18th century and transforms within 100 years not just how things are made but how people live, where they live, what they believe, and how the world is organized. It also creates the material conditions for the greatest empires the world has ever seen. Chapter 79, The Industrial Revolution, Why Britain? The question historians have debated for 2 centuries. The answer seems to involve a combination of factors that came together at a particular moment: coal and iron deposits in close proximity, navigable rivers and a long coastline that made transport cheap, a stable banking system and patent law that protected inventors, a culture of practical tinkering that valued the clever solution over theoretical elegance, and the enclosure of common land that pushed rural workers into cities, creating the workforce that factories needed. James Watt's improvement of the steam engine in 1769, his separate condenser that dramatically increased efficiency, was the key enabling technology. Steam could now drive factories, then locomotives, then ships. By 1850, steam was the universal power source of industry. The factory system that steam power enabled transformed human life in ways both liberating and brutal. The long hours, the dangerous conditions, the employment of children as young as 5, all of these were features of early industrial life that social reformers documented with horror. The Factory Acts, beginning in 1833, started the long process of regulation. But the damage done to the first generation of industrial workers was immense. George Stephenson's rocket of 1829 opened the railway age. By 1914, the world had 650,000 miles of railway track. Journey times that had been measured in days became hours. National markets became possible. Empires could be administered. Chapter 80, Darwin and the Theory of Evolution. In 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. The book sold out on its first day. It has never gone out of print. Darwin had spent 5 years on the voyage of the Beagle, collecting specimens across the globe. The finches of the Galapagos Islands, with their subtly different beak shapes adapted to different food sources, became the most famous evidence for what he eventually argued, that species are not fixed at creation, but change over time through a process he called natural selection. The mechanism was simple and devastating. Individuals with traits better suited to their environment survive longer and reproduce more successfully than those less well suited. Over generations, the better adapted traits spread through the population. Given enough time, this process can produce entirely new species from common ancestors, including humans. Darwin spelled out the implications for human origins in The Descent of Man in 1871. We share ancestors with other primates. The controversy this produced has never entirely subsided. Darwin's ideas were misappropriated almost immediately. Social Darwinism, the application of survival of the fittest to human society, was used to justify imperialism, racial hierarchy, and economic ruthlessness. Darwin himself did not advocate these uses. The misuse of his science caused immense suffering. Chapter 81, Karl Marx. In 1848, as revolutions erupted across Europe, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published a short pamphlet that began, "A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism." The Communist Manifesto went on to argue that all of human history is the history of class struggle, that economic forces, not ideas or great men, drive historical change, and that capitalism would inevitably be overthrown by the working class it exploited. Marx's analysis was more sophisticated in his major work Capital, published in 1867. His concept of surplus value, that workers create more value than they receive in wages, and that the difference is captured by capitalists as profit, provided the theoretical foundation for a critique of capitalism that influenced sociology, economics, and history for the next century and a half. In practice, Marxist revolutions took power in Russia, China, Cuba, and elsewhere, and produced authoritarian states rather than the stateless, classless utopia Marx had envisioned. But the fear of revolution drove democratic governments to introduce welfare states, labor protections, and social safety nets that transformed the lives of working people. Even in the countries where Marxism was never tried, its influence as a challenge to liberal capitalism and as an analytical tool was enormous. Chapters 82 through 85, Empire, Nationalism and the Road to War. The Industrial Revolution gave European nations capabilities that were historically unprecedented. Railway networks, telegraph communication, repeating firearms, quinine against malaria, steam-powered gunboats. These technologies made the conquest and administration of vast tropical territories possible in ways that had not been before. The result was the scramble for Africa. In 1880, Europeans controlled roughly 10% of Africa. By 1914, they controlled 90%. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, at which 14 European powers divided the continent among themselves without the presence of a single African representative, was the formal mechanism of this partition. The British Empire at its peak covered a quarter of the Earth's land surface. India, the jewel in the crown, produced revenues that subsidized the empire's operations and markets that absorbed its industrial output. But the 1857 Indian Rebellion demonstrated the fragility of imperial control, and the empire simultaneously educated the nationalist leaders who would eventually end it. Gandhi studied law in London, Nehru studied at Cambridge. The unification of Germany under Bismarck in 1871 created the most powerful state in Europe. A new industrial giant at the center of the continent, Germany needed markets, colonies, naval power, and international prestige, all of which alarmed Britain and France. The alliance systems that formed around this new reality were the mechanism through which a regional crisis would become a world war. In June 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne was assassinated by a Bosnian Serb nationalist in Sarajevo. Within 6 weeks, through a cascade of alliances, mobilizations, and ultimatums, a local assassination had become the most destructive war in human history. The world that the Industrial Revolution had built was about to destroy itself. End of Part 12.